Hi, good evening.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so last time we started talking about the issue of sailing before Shabbat. So we're going to continue with that. So I think we have to finish the bit Yosef. We're still going on there. So it says, so it's according to this, im ena mayim meluchim. So if it's not salty water, afilu nichnas besfina berev Shabbat. If he goes into, even if he goes in, if he boards the ship on Erev Shabbat, Share, it will be allowed. Afa pi she'en b'mayim asat tfachim, even though there isn't 10 tfachim in the water. Veishtamit te lemor teshuvat Rambam. So he says he didn't receive the tshuva of the Rambam, Shechtov b'samuchik, which I'm going to write close by. Shehi oseret le'alech b'Shabbat b'sfinat chutz v'tchum. So that forbids that tshuva to travel on Shabbat with a boat outside the boundaries. Im en amayim geboim asat tfachim. Right, if the water is not above the ground, 10 tfachim. Mistama lo paliga harif. So it says we assume that he's not arguing with the Rif, Rabbo, who's his Rabbo, his Rebbe. Okay? So I've already stated, several times that here we call the Rif the Rebbe of the Rambam, but the truth is, right, in history, he never saw the Rif, or he never met him. So then why do they call him his rabbi? Because his rabbi was learned from the Rif. So it was like a second generation. Who was this rabbi? The Rimigash, right? Was the rabbi of the Rambam. And he was the Talmid, he was a student of the Rif. So there is a chain there, right, of tradition going on there. Even though he directly did not learn from him. But he got his Torah from his rabbi. Okay. The all Shehen Meshavim Batam Misur. So he says they're also right. They also match when it comes to the reason of the prohibition, la flig to sail. The all the pashat divrei arif mechichin ken. So this is also the simple wording of the rif proves this. ולמה לה למשכוני נפשין להוציאן mipshatan. So it says, therefore, why should we, go out of our way uh, to divert the words of the Rif right out of their simple meaning? Hilkach en nir'in divrei Maharik zal bezeh. So he says, therefore, the Maharik doesn't seem right when he's what he's saying regarding this. Okay. והגאות בפרק ל', הגאות, right, Maimoniot, כתבו בשם רבנו תם. He writes the name of רבנו תם. שהטעם מפני איסור תחומין. So רבנו תם says the reason because the prohibition is because of the boundaries. ואם כן לא עשרינן אלא בספינה גוששת. So he says therefore we only forbid with a ship, which is like sailing in shallow waters. אבל שאינה גוששת, but if it's not so shallow, מותר, then it's allowed. שאין תחומין מעלה מעשרה. As we mentioned last week, right? Because the prohibition of boundaries does not apply when you're above 10 tfachim. The ship is high up above the ground. So if you remember, we said, right, that 10 tfachim is like waist high, So if it's higher than that, that's already, there's no prohibition. So he says, "Ve'al zeh somchin ha'olam," says, on this, right, people rely, bisfina merev Shabbat, to go on a, right, to go on a ship on Friday. Velifrosh bayam, and to go, right, tagadol, to go into the Mediterranean Sea. Umiu katru she'en yireh le'aram. But he says the Ram doesn't agree with this. Teha ibayalan, because we asked in the Gemara there in Eruvin, Mem Gil Amud Aleph, im yesh techumin lemala me'asara, if there is, right, prohibition of boundaries when you're above 10 tefachim. Ve'avdinan lechumra, so he says we go stringent. Teha lo ifshita, because this question was not answered in the Gemara. כתוב בתשובות הרמב"ם שכן היה דעת חכמי בבל. So it says also the rabbis of Bavel, right, Iraq, also agreed with this. לאסור הליכה בנהרות, to go even in the rivers, right, in the ship, whatever. משום דכיוון דבעיה דאם יש תחומין למעלה מעשרה, because since, right, there's a question in the Gemara regarding boundaries above 10 tfachim, לא הפשיטה. This question was not answered in the Gemara. And we hold, right, that if you're going outside of 12 mil from your boundary, that's already from the Torah. So therefore it becomes a doubt from the Torah, which is stringent. So he answers like this, right, that when it comes to the dry land, that there the prohibition of tchumin, right, of boundaries, is from the Torah. So it says then that's the case. That since our question lo pshita was not answered in the Gemara, naktina lechumra. So therefore we go stringent. But b'mayim she'en sham isur techumin deoraita. But when it comes to water, right, the prohibition is not from the Torah, and therefore mishum delo damel in machane Israel. Why? Because it doesn't resemble the encampment of the Jews, right, in the desert. Keman delo mitzar ela midrabanan. So since it's only forbidden from the rabbis, naktinan bayan lekula. So therefore, he says we go lenient with this. Then tichumin lemala masara. So we say, right, that there is no boundaries above 10 tfachim. So this is going according to the general rule, right, which is that when there is a doubt regarding something from the rabbis, we go lenient, right? And this is the example of that. Im lab mutar. So he said, but if it's not above 10 tefachim, it's allowed. אפילו היכא דמספק עלה אם הם למה למסרה. So even if you have a doubt about this, right, whether it's above 10 tefachim or not, אם לאו, מותר, it's still allowed, להלך בהם עד שתתאמת לנו שבגובהן פחות מ10 טפחים. So he says, until you know for sure that it's above 10 it's less than 10 tefachim. שאז אסור להלך בהם מחוץ לתחום הדרבנן. So then it's going to be forbidden to go in them, right, outside your boundaries from the rabbis. ולדעת הריף והרמב"ם והראש, so this is according to all these rabbis. בימים המלוכים, when it comes to salty water, right, seas and oceans, בכל גבלה אסור, it's going to be forbidden anyway. משום דביטול עונג Shabbat. Why? Because you're going to have the problem with the עונג Shabbat, right, enjoying Shabbat like that. ונהרות הנובעים, אם אינם עמוקים 10 לכולי עלמא, אסור. So it says, when you have a river, which is shallow, not 10 tefachim, everybody agrees that it's forbidden. משום דאף על גב דלת בהות ביטול עונג Shabbat. עונג, says even though there's no prohibition regarding עונג Shabbat, enjoying Shabbat, because it's fresh water, right? So it's not really a problem. Ika isur techumin. So he says, therefore, there is prohibition of boundaries. Kol she'en mekarka asfina karka nahar asar tefachim. If you don't have 10 tefachim, right, between uh, the ground and the ship. אבל אם יש מקרקע הספינה קרקע לנהר יותר מ10 טפחים, but if there is in the ship from the ground to the ship more than 10 tefachim, the Rosh, according to Rosh, והר"ם and the Ram, the nakte bayad tchumin lemala mesara. They say that when it comes to the prohibition of tchumin above 10 tefachim, lechumra, they go stringent with that. Lo chalku ben yam levasha. So they didn't make any differentiation between the sea and the ground. Asur, it's going to be forbidden. Ulambam the nachatla be'avim v'nerot lekula. So it says according to Rambam. That he says, right, that when it comes to the sea and the oceans, we go lenient, share, then it will be allowed. So it's going to be a machloket here regarding this. With Ramban, Rashba, great Ramban, Rashba, Nami share, it's going to be allowed. She'afa pi shelo chilku ben yam levasha, even though they didn't differentiate between the sea and the ground, ha naktinan la lebayat tchumin, but it says that we said that the question about boundaries of 10 tefachim, the kula, we're lenient about that. כמו שכתב רבנו ירוחם בחלק י"ח, like it says רבי ירוחם, ומה שחולקים הרמב"ן והרשב"א בעניין זה אכתוב בסימן ת"ד. So it says there's also a machloket between the Rambam and the Rashba. So I'm going to write that in a later chapter regarding that. Okay, great. So that's good. Okay, so I guess we're ready to look at the Shulchan Aruch. Let's see what we got here. Right, this was Aleph and Bet. We got both of them. So let's take a look. Doesn't Shulchan Aruch, מותר להפליג בספינה אפילו בערב שבת. Right, you're allowed to sail, right, on the boat, even erev Shabbat. Im holech ledabar mitzvah. If he's going for a mitzvah matter, as we said, right? If it's a mitzvah matter, the rabbis did not decree. So what will be an example that it's a mitzvah matter? Let's say, he's going to collect tzedakah, for the community, whatever, for the yeshiva. So if that's his thing, it's a mitzvah matter. Posek imo sheyeshbot. So look what he says, right? But you have to tell the operator, right, of the boat, you know what? I want you to rest on Shabbat. I want you to not sail. So he says, but if he doesn't want to do it, it's no problem. In other words, let's say he refuses, right, the goy. He says, listen, I can't do that. I can't stop in the middle of the ocean. What do you want me to do? So, he doesn't listen to you. It's okay. You don't have to fight with him, You don't have to throw him into the water. It's okay. No problem. That's his decision, right? He's doing it for himself. אבל הדבר הרשות אין מפליגים בספינה. But he says when it comes to something which is right, not mitzvah matter, right? It's just something optional. So then, פחות מגימל ימים קודם השבת. We don't go less than 3 days before Shabbat. So what does that mean? We can't go on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, right? We got to go a different time. So says the Rama here, אבל קודם השלושה ימים שרת. But before that it's allowed, says the Rama, אפילו בספינה שמושכים אותה על ידי בהמות. Even if they're pulling that boat, right, by way of animals, אפילו אין בגובה המים, says even if the height of the water is not, 10 טפחים. אפילו במקום שיצטרך לישראל לעשות even if in a place where a Jew will have to אחר כך מלאכה בשבת, he'll have to do some labor on Shabbat להוליך הספינה, to push the boat, to row the boat. Wow. So he brings this from the tshuva of the Rivash. We didn't see this in the Bet Yosef. That's very interesting. I'm not really sure if this is the halacha, but anyway, right? The Ramah does bring it, so that's interesting. So therefore, what do you see? That okay? Well, I'm going to summarize it later, right? When we finish it. Ve'im hu derech mu'at. So he says, but if it's a small, right? If it's a small cruise, kimo mitzor letzidon, right? For instance, you're going from Tzor to Tzidon, which is like we said, right? In Bet Yosef, it's 1 day travel. Shen b'nehem ki yom malach yom echad. Mutar le'aflig. So there, you're allowed to right sail the erev Shabbat. Okay, even you can go Friday morning, right? So how is that? Because you'll be back by before Shabbat, basically. It's like 12 hours, something like that, let's say 11 hours. So you'll be back home by Shabbat, or you'll be at your destination by Shabbat, right? Whatever. So you see from there, by the way, that the truth is that one time uh, a friend of mine, asked me a question about this. I really should actually, I forgot to write about this, to post it, but really neither. I really should. But anyway, right? He asked me about a case where, a flight, he's gonna have to do this for a flight. So what does that mean? He asked me, are you allowed to take off on Friday, on the plane, and you get your destination on Sunday, because of the time difference. So you're gonna be flying on Shabbat, you know. So he asked me, are you allowed to do this or not? So the truth is, I popped into my head this halacha because that's where it comes from, right? This whole concept. So I told him, I said, are you really going to be able to, enjoy Shabbat on the plane? So the truth is that, people don't usually get sick on the plane. They don't get seasick. They don't throw up usually. Usually they don't. Sometimes they do. But it's not very common really. So it's not really as bad as the ship. You know. So what I told him was, listen, uh, you're gonna have a problem because what do you call it? As long as you can enjoy Shabbat there, right? They're gonna give you meals, and you can sleep a little bit, and stretch out. The guy's rich, so I figure he's gonna take like a first class flight. He's going to the Far East, right? So, so it'll probably work out. So I said, look, it's better not to do it this way, but if you got no choice, I would say it's okay. I mean, because when he lands, it's going to be already, Shabbat is going to be over. The flight is like, I don't know, whatever, 18 hours, God knows, I don't know what it is. going to the Far East. Okay, so right, so basically, right, you just have to plug in, these rules here into the in the case of the plane, and you have to see what comes out. So, we don't really have motion sickness on planes, like we have on ships. So it's not really the same thing. So the rabbis didn't never decreed on that. So therefore, if there's no choice, I told him, I said, if there's a choice, better not to do it this way. Obviously, sit home and enjoy Shabbat at home, but you have no choice. He tells me it's for business, I got to be there, right? Whatever, I have a meeting there. So, and he has no other way to do it, whatever. So I said, okay, if that's the only way you can do it, what can you do? I can't. So I told him, it may, you may be able to get away with it. So in the end, he told me he didn't really buy the ticket. He chose not to do it, but I think that was better. But if there was no choice, I would say according to what we're learning over here, so it's allowed. There's no problem with that. Okay, so and the Ramah is telling you, you know, even if he has to break Shabbat, it will be okay. Which is really, something out of the ordinary. Okay, very interesting. The imhu derech muat, as we already said, right? If it's a small trip, it's no problem. מקום שנהגו שלא להפליג בערב שבת כלל, אפילו דרך מועט אין מפליגים. So he says, but if you live in a place where the custom is not to do these things, right, then you should not do it. So, why does he bring this? Because there's a Gemara, Masechet Psachim, over there, right? There's a story there. They came to Rabbi Yochanan. They asked him, about this. That in our town, people don't do it. So are we allowed to, change a custom? So Rabbi Yochanan said, no. If that's a custom in your town, you got to keep your custom. So even though you're being stringent, which is beyond the halacha, but since that's a minhag, you got to do it. That's what he. That's what he said. So that's where he brings this from, right? This piece over here. Okay, great. So we have a little bit more. Another Shulchan Aruch. So says Shulchan Aruch in bed, how the en maflegin b'sfina pachot mishlosha yamim. So is that which we said, right? That we don't sail in a ship less than 3 days from Shabbat, Kolam Shabbat, Hatam Mishum Oneg Shabbat. It's because of Oneg Shabbat, right? You're not going to enjoy Shabbat like that. Shekol Shlosha Yamim Arishonim, Yesh Lehem Tsar B'Bilbul. Because it says the first 3 days when you're on the ship, right? You're getting nauseous and throwing up. That's what happens, right? To a lot of people. Right? So you don't want to get involved with this on Shabbat, right? You don't want to be throwing up on Shabbat. That's not exactly enjoyment of Shabbat. So he says that's only if they're right sailing on salty water, right? As we said. But he says when it comes to the rivers, right, there is no problem there with the rivers. So you're allowed to sail even on Friday. Right? So we already said, right, that the reason why it's not a problem with the rivers is because there's no motion sickness there, from the waves. And also, we said, right, because the water is not salty. That's another reason. So because of those two things, right, the rivers don't really have a problem. So he says, therefore, it's going to be allowed, right, to sail even Erev Shabbat. But that's if we don't know, right, that the depth of the water, asat vachim. But it says on the other hand, but if you know that it's less than 10 tfachim, right? Asur. That's going to be forbidden because of the prohibition of tchumin, right? Of boundaries. Mishum isur tchumin, right? So, if you're going in shallow waters, right, that's a different story. Today, we don't really sail in shallow waters. You know, there may be some rivers, that have that. But in general, right, we don't have situations like that. You never know. But in general, right, we don't have that. Okay, great. So let's look at the Ramah. There's a little bit more Ramah here. וכן בספינה שיצטרך ישראל לבוא לידי מהלכות שבת, אסור להיכנס בה שלושה ימים קודם לשבת. So this is also in a case where he's going to have to do labor, right? What does that mean? He's going to have to row the boat. My God. It's going to be forbidden, right, to go there within 3 days. אפילו הם נהרות הנובעים והיא למעלה מהשר, even if it's a river, he says. Wow. And then he says, אבל אין איסור במה שהבהמות מושכות הספינה בשפת הנהר. But he says there's no prohibition that the animals are pulling the ship. Right? Today we don't have that, but ולא דמה להליכה בקרון שאסור. So he said doesn't resemble the case of walking in the in the carriage, which is forbidden. Okay, so that's a mouthful. Yeah, so these halachot, are sometimes practical. People have, issues like this. They have to travel on a boat. Just, I remember, the last week, a friend of mine comes up to me. He doesn't know that we're studying this, but he told me, he says, my rabbi says my parents are going on a cruise. They live in Israel, and but he says they're sailing on Sunday. Uh, you know, but his question was a little bit different. I thought he was talking. I thought he was, referring to Shabbat. So if you're sailing on Sunday, right, that will be fine. But what he told me was that what he called his question was about something else. He said Sunday is going to be the 17th of Tammuz, which is a fast day. So he told me, the question was, are you allowed to sail on that day? So I said, yeah, there's no problem. You can sail that day. The rabbis never decreed, right, not to travel on those days, of 3 weeks. Rabbis never made decrees like that. Take a vacation, things like this. No, there's no such a thing like that. Okay, that's the story there. So yeah, that's the story. That's really a different issue. So let's move on. Let's go to Gimel, unless you have any questions.
No questions.
No question. Okay, let's move on. So it says over here in Bet Yosef, Tur. It says, "Ba'kom shemotzin liknot mazon." Not this one. This one. So it says, "Mash katav Rabbeinu b'shem Bahag." Right, and that which writes in the Torah, name of the Bahag, Katav alav Gaon Mari Avuhav. So it says the Rab Mari Avuhav regarding this. Deate b'shitat Rashbam. So he says it goes like the Rashbam. De'amar de baraita zo den mafligin bet Shammai he de lebet. So he says this. Right, we already said this, right? That according to this opinion, that which they said in the Talmud, not to sail erev Shabbat, is the opinion of Bet Shammai. So there is an opinion like this. We don't paskin like that, but anyway. The Bet Hillel, but it says according to Bet Hillel, Shara, it's allowed really. Lafliga afilu be'erev Shabbat. You're allowed to go even erev Shabbat. Men only early, so it says it doesn't seem right to me. The Inken lo havu shatke tasot, because otherwise tasot wouldn't have been silent here, right? They would have said it, talked about this. Ve'arosh and also the Rosh Milamar the Bahag Savar Kedat Rambam to say that the Bahag holds like the Rambam. V'gam Rabbeinu lo hava shatik milamar, and also he says the Tur wouldn't have been silent to from saying Shadat Rashbam. I said Rambam. I should have said Rashbam. Right? Not Rambam. Shadat Rashbam Kadat Bahag. Rashbam holds like Bahag. Lechach Nireli. So he says, therefore, it seems to me, the Bahag Nami Savar de Braita de En Mafligin Kebet Hillel, that the Bahag also holds, right, that this Braita that talks about sailing is going to Bet Hillel. Nami Atya. It comes, Umiu, Hechad Shekarka Asfina Gavua Asrat Vachim, but it says, if the right the ship is 10 tfachim above the ground, so then Mikarka Nahar from the Deleka Mishum Isut Chumin. So there's no prohibition of boundaries. V'gam hem maim noveim. So it's also it's flowing water. The let behu mishum bitul oneg Shabbat. And it doesn't cause you a problem with the oneg Shabbat, right? As we said, right, when the water is flowing and there's no waves, so there's no issue of motion sickness there. The mutar le'aflig afilu be'erev Shabbat ledivri hakol. That it's allowed, right, to sail even Arab Shabbat, according to everybody. The lo aire behachi matnita. So it says because the Braita is not talking about that. Then mafligin ata bahag lememar, and so then comes the bahag to say the mutar likanes ba b'Shabbat ulaflig kol shekana sham shevita. So according to bahag, right, if you acquired your right dwelling place there before Shabbat, you can even board the ship on Shabbat itself. So what does that mean? It means like this, right? You already went in before on Friday, whatever, and you checked into your room there, right? In your cruise, uh, and now you left, and on Shabbat you want to come back, right, and sail. So he allows that if you already boarded. So why is that? Because now your dwelling place is there in that room, right? That your the cabin there, right? That's your dwelling place for Shabbat. You acquired it. So then he goes on, the Ri Asar, but the Ri right forbids this. Afilu hu tochat chum, even if it's inside the boundaries. Vegam hem neharot nov'in. So it's flowing waters, right? Mishum shehu, what I meant to say is flowing waters. It's like a river, right? No waves. Mishum shehu keshat al pnei hamayim. It's like a person who's just swimming on the water. Shasur gezerah. It's forbidden because of the decree Shema Yaseh Chabit Shel Chay Shetim, because he may make a life raft, right? When he's swimming, or Shema Yanhig Asfina Arba Amot Bekarmelit, or maybe he'll push the boat, right, 4 amot in the Carmelit, where it's forbidden to travel to carry. וכמו שכתבו התוספות בראש, like it says in תוספות בראש, בריש פרק מי שהוציאו, in this פרק. ולפי זה ביאור דברי רבנו כך הם. So it's according to this, right, the explanation, right, of the words of the tour is like this. בתחילה כתב שיש מפרשים תם דין מפלגין ג' ימים. In the beginning, he wrote that some say, right, the reason is that you shouldn't sail 3 days before Shabbat unless it's mishum isur techumin, because of the boundaries. The Rif piresh shatam mishum onik Shabbat, but the Rif says it's because of onik Shabbat. Ulchach matirin benaharot v'novim. So therefore, he says we do allow in the case of the flowing rivers, right? As we said, there's no waves there, so there's no motion sickness. Shenu mista'er, that he doesn't have a problem with that. It doesn't bother him. It doesn't make him nauseous. But he says then, right, that he wrote that whenever right the whenever you have the flowing rivers, the let behu isura laflig be'erev Shabbat. There's no prohibition to sail on erev Shabbat. L'inyan laflig beShabbat atzma have plugta. But he says regarding going on Shabbat itself. So there's a machloket, right? The bahag veri, as we said, right? Bahag allows this, and the re doesn't allow. Ulabahag im kana sham shvita mutar. According to Bahag, as we said, right? If he acquired his domain there, right on the ship, he checked in already. It's allowed, afilu b'Shabbat, even on Shabbat. Ulri asur, according to me, it's forbidden. Afilu be'erev Shabbat, even erev Shabbat. Kimo she'evar b'sefrat ri b'samuch. We're going to explain the opinion of the ri close by. Okay, great. So let's see how much we got here. Long one. Okay. Okay. We may be able to finish it. No promises. Okay, so let's continue. So it says, "V'dash svara zo de bahag." So you should know that this opinion of Bahag Ketava Ran, the Ran has also written this, prepared Kama de Shabbat, the first parak of Shabbat. V'zeh leshano, this language of the Ran. L'fichach nohagim achshav shemitkansim b'toch hasfina. So he says, therefore, the custom is now, because of this Bahag, that we check into the boat, right, to the ship. Me'erev Shabbat, Erev Shabbat. U'mesadrin sham shulchan, and we set up a table there, right? Madlikin et hanerot, and we light candles for Shabbat. Liknot sham shvita. Why is that? Because this way we acquire the domain there, right, for Shabbat. V'chakach chozrin v'nichnasim b'ava Shabbat. And then we come in on Shabbat, right, to the boat. V'osim kach mipnei she'asfina atida letzet b'Shabbat. The reason we do it this way is because the boat is going to sail on Shabbat. It's not sailing on Friday. It's going to go outside the boundaries. It's going to be forbidden to move around over there and there. Outside of that format, because he didn't dwell in the inside the boundaries of the ship, right? The enclosure. Before Shabbat. But since he goes in on Erev Shabbat, right, to go in there, נעשה כמערב ברגליו, כמערב ברגליו. So then it's going to be, right, that he is acquiring a right dwelling place by going there. ואומר כאן תהא שביתתי, and he says, right, this is going to be my dwelling place for Shabbat. וכיוון דקונה שם שביתה, so once he acquires a dwelling place over there, שובת באוויר מחיצות מבעוד יום. So then he can dwell, right, in the airspace, right, of the ship before Shabbat. So then he can walk throughout the whole ship. He's not going to be limited how much he can walk around. Because it's going to like 4 amot. That's the end of it. So there you go, right? The Ran seems to paskin, right, like the Bahag, that this is allowed to do. Yeah. Wow. Okay, very interesting. So, so he says, I wonder, if that's the case, why do we really have to set up a table there? ולהדליק נרות בשיחיו בספינה, right? So he says because when they're gonna be right in the boat, when it gets dark, they're gonna be anyway requiring a space there. ואפשר שעושים כן. So he says it's possible that they're doing this כדי לפרסם שקנו שם שפיטה, in order to publicize that they acquired a dwelling place there. But he says, nevertheless, right, it's true the below kiddush na mishare, that it's really allowed also if they didn't do all this setup there. וכן כתוב באגרות עשירי, it also says this in this book, פרק מי שהוציאו, וזה לשונו, this is what it says, right? אי אפשר לקנות שביתת בספינת בשום עניין אם לא שיכנס בה בעצמו. It's not possible, right, to acquire a dwelling place in the ship in any way, right, unless he goes in there by himself, right, in the twilight time. וישב שם בין השמשות, he gets to be there at twilight, right, before the night. ולאחר בין השמשות ילך לביתו. And then once, right, it gets dark, he can now go home, right, ויאכל, can eat at home. וישוב בספינה אחר אכילתו, and then he can come back after he eats, right, בלילה, after he eats his meal at night. ולמחר, right, or tomorrow in the morning, ביום. אבל הרשב"א בתשובה כתב, but the Rashba says, right, דאילו הנכנסים בערב Shabbat בספינת מקדשין שם, so it says those that come into the ship, right, and make kiddush there, right, ואחר כך יוצאים, and then they go out, לא עלה בידם כלום, they haven't really acquired that space. The משעה שעלו לבשה קנו שם בשביתה. Why? Because once they go on the ground, right, they go back, onto the dry ground, they acquire their, right, dwelling there now. They change their dwelling. אפילו בחצי שבת, even half Shabbat. וגם התוספות והראש כתוב בריש פרק מי שהוציאו. So it says Tosfot also in the Rosh, they wrote regarding this, שאותם בני אדם שמדליקים נרות, those people who light candles, right, בספינה, on the ship, בערב שבת, ערב שבת, ואוכלים שם מסמכים על כך להפליג בספינה בשבת. And then they rely on this to sail on the ship on Shabbat. לא שפיר out there, they're not doing properly, he says. סוף סוף הם מפליגים בשבת, because in the end, right, they're sailing on Shabbat. That's the end of it. So we see, right, there's a machloket about this. It's very interesting point here. בין המוסרים, so it says, אלא כשאחד שקידשו שם יוצאים מחוץ לספינה. But he says they only forbid this where, he made kiddush and then he left the boat, right, to go home. ואחר כך חוזרים ונכנסים בה. So then, right, they come back, right, on Shabbat, בשבת. מפני שהם מפליגים בשבת, because in the end, right, they're sailing on Shabbat. האם נכנס בה בערב שבת, but if he went in there ערב שבת, ולא יצא משם עד שהפליגה, and he didn't leave there until he, right, the boat sailed, sharet, it's going to be allowed. דכיוון שאינו נכנס עכשיו לתוכה, because since he doesn't go now inside there, שכבר היה שם מבעוד יום, because he was already there before Shabbat. לא מקרה מפליג דאיהו, that's not called sailing, דאיהו לאו מידי עביד, because he hasn't done anything, וכן כתב הראש בתשובה, that's what the Rosh says also. Wow. וכן נראה מדברי הרשב"א, also רשב"א, שכתבתי בסמוך, the roads close by, he says, ומה שכתב הרשב"א, so he says, that which the Rashba said. דמשעה שעלו ליבשה, from the time that they went up to the dry land, קנו שם שביתה, they acquired their dwelling place there, ואפילו בחצי שבת, even if it's a half a Shabbat. To me, Ali says, I'm wondering about this, קניית שביתה אינה אלא בין השמשות. But he says, really, you can only acquire your dwelling place during the twilight, right? So then how is it that he acquires it after that? When you read the Mishum, the Stam Sfina Havia B'Maim Shem V'Mala Mesa. So he says, it seems like because usually a boat, right, is above the 10 tfachim in the water, Lo Kana Sham Shvita, you don't really acquire there your dwelling place. Shilkach, therefore he says, Kashiyotze Levasha, when he comes down on the dry land, Afilu Bechatzi Shabbat, even half a Shabbat, Koneh Sham, he does acquire their Shvita, the dwelling place. Ukamoshi Yitber B'Siman Taf Dal, like it's going to be explained over there in this chapter. Right? Okay, that's going to be later on. Way later. Okay, great. Let's move on. מתוך דברי התוספות, so it says from the words of Tosfot in the Rosh, משמע לי, שטעם בהאג, it implies to me, says that the reason of בהאג הוא מפני שאם נכנס בה בשבת, that he went in there, if he went in there on Shabbat, בלי קניית השביתה, without acquiring a dwelling place, כשהיא מפלגת בשבת, So then when the ship leaves on Shabbat, it seems like he's going out of his boundary. But when he acquires right the dwelling place, when he goes in there on Shabbat, it's like going into his house. And then if afterwards, right, he sails outside the boundary, let lamba, we don't really care about that. Because he's not doing any deed by right by going out of the boundary. But they ask about this, right? They question this. So but in the end, right, they're selling on Shabbat. So meaning to say that if they are going in there on Shabbat, so they are doing certain things, right, to sail on Shabbat. So he says, if they even if they acquire their dwelling, what does that matter, right? Still, it's going to be a problem. But what about the Ritva? So right in right Masechet Shabbat it says over there. Ali Bayad Tchumin Lemala Mesara. Regarding the question about the boundaries being above 10 tefachim, the Loiv Shita, that this question wasn't answered. Katav Sharabenu Gadol. So he says the great rabbi, right? Our great rabbi. Who was the great rabbi? The Ramban, because he was the father of this line of rabbis. Um, Ve'araz zal pasku de lekula. So they paskin lenient naktinan la desfika de rabbanan hu. Why? Because it's a rabbinical doubt. Ve'al kach hitir ve'al ken hitir Rabbeinu l'kanes b'sfina shel goyim. So he says, therefore, right, Rabbeinu allowed the Ramban to go into a boat, which is for goyim, b'Shabbat on Shabbat. V'chen yired mimenu, also to get off as well. Be'egyan de'yavasha, to come when they come to the dry land. B'Shabbat on Shabbat. Sharei lo kanu shvita bayam. Why? Because they never acquired right a dwelling place on the sea. למעלה מעשרה, since they're above 10 טפחים. וכן פסקו בתוספות, also תוספות says like that, ומה שנהגו עם כשרוצים להיכנס בספינה, and they want to go into a boat בשבת, שהולכים מקדשים שם מערב שבת, they go and they make kiddush over there ערב שבת, כדי שיקנו שם שמיטה, in order to acquire right the dwelling place there, למעלה מעשרה, about 10 טפחים, לא היה צריך, you don't need that, he says. Because since there's no boundaries, right, above 10 טפחים, הרי בלא זה יכולים להיכנס בשם בשבת. So they can go in there on Shabbat anyway. Oh boy, oh. So apparently, right, he allows you to go in on Shabbat, right, even without being there before. They want to acquire, right, dwelling place above 10 טפחים. כדי שאם יגיעו, and if they go למחר בנמל, if they go but tomorrow right to the port, שיהיו רשאים להיכנס שם, they should be forbidden to go in there. I'm sorry, they should be permitted to go in there. ויהיו כנראה העיר, they're going to be like the dwellers of the city, ואילו הייתה שביתתם בבתיהם, בביתם, but if their dwelling place was in the house, לא היו זזים ממקומן, they wouldn't move from their place, מתוך הספינה, right, from the ship, שהרי חזרו למטה מעשרה, because now they're right on the ground. and they distance themselves from their boundary. So it's even according to this opinion, כי אותן שקידשו בספינה, that those that made kiddush right in the boat, שלא יחזרו אחר כך, they shouldn't go back there afterwards לבשה בשבת, to go back to the ground, right, to the dry land on Shabbat. שאם כן, because if so, כיוון שלא קנו שביתה בספינה, because since they didn't acquire, right, the dwelling place in the boat, למעלה מיוד, since they're above 10 טפחים, הרי הם קונים Shvidat ve'evasha. They acquire, right, the dwelling place on the ground. So then, what did it help them that they made kedusha on the boat? It's a good point, right? He's right on the money. This guy. Oh my God. Ah, boy. So yeah, there you go, right? So he's definitely deflecting the other opinion. No, very, very well, very strong here. ומה הועיל להם מה שקידשו בספינה? So then what's going to help you to if they can make kedusha in that boat? הוודאי לא מעלה ולא מוריד. So he says it's not going to help you, not going to hurt you, it's not going to do nothing, right? It's worthless. It's a worthless endeavor. Oh boy. So bottom line, right? Now here comes the bit Yosef and says, ולעניין ההלכה הדבר הזה תלוי במנהג המדינה. So he says, halachically speaking, right? What's the halacha? Bottom line, right? We have here several opinions. So he says it depends on the custom of the right of the country you live in. במקום שנהגו היתר מותר, ובמקום שנהגו איסור אסור. Wherever it's customary to permit this, it's allowed. Wherever it's not customary, it's forbidden. Right? אסור להתיר them, so you're not allowed to permit it to them. Wow. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. So I'm understanding from his words like this that he's trying to say that there is a machloket whether you can board the ship on Shabbat. Some allow this and some don't allow. So it depends on the custom of the place. Wow. Incredible. Okay. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. ומש כתב שהתיר רבנו להיכנס בספינה, and that what you said, right? That the Ritva, that the Ramban allowed to go into the ship של גויים בשבת, of goyim on Shabbat, לכתוב בסמוך טעם ההיתר. So I'm going to write, close by, write the reason for this. Wow. Okay. ולעניין ההיתר ירידה מן הספינה. What about coming off the ship, right? לנמל, to go into the port, right? Are you allowed to do this on Shabbat? שהגיע בשבת. Let's say the ship came on Shabbat. So the question is, are you allowed to onboard the ship on Shabbat? Echtov b'siman tav daled says I'm going to write a different chapter about this. Right? But according to what the Ritva said, right, apparently it's allowed to do this. But there's going to be some issues, because there could be some issues with your luggage, right? Things like this. You have to be careful about the luggage. There would have to be issues with that because you couldn't take the luggage yourself, carry the luggage. So you'd have to probably get a goy to do that for you. It's a whole issue there. Okay, so we'll talk about that some other time. But anyway, in its proper time and place, we'll get into that issue. That's also an interesting issue. מה שכתב רבנו ברי עשה הכל אפילו תוך התחום. So he says that which the Rabbeinu said, right? The tour that the Ri forbade this, right? Even inside the tchum, inside the boundaries. מפני שהוא shot because he's right sailing on the ship on the seas. כך כתב התוספות, that's what it says in תוספות בראש בראש פרק מי שהוציאו. this פרק. ולכאורה לא סגי הדהמה. So he says apparently this reasoning is not enough. אלא לאסור להפליג בשבת עצמה. That would only, right, be sufficient to forbid to sail on Shabbat itself. אבל לא לאסור להפליג קודם שבת, but not before Shabbat. דאם לא כן, מה עיריה 3 ימים קודם שבת? So, because otherwise, right, well, what is the significance of saying 3 days before Shabbat? מיום ראשון, from Sunday, נמי ליצר, then you should be forbid this even on Sunday. אבל מאחר שכתבו התוספות דברי רי, it says, since, right, the Tosfot wrote the words of the Ri, Beperet Kama de Shabbat, on the first paragraph of Shabbat, Abraita, regarding the Braita, the En Mafligin Shlosha Yamim Kodem HaShabbat, that we don't sail 3 days before Shabbat. Mashma shemitam ze asur leaflig. it implies that from this reason it's forbidden right to sail שלושה ימים קודם Shabbat, to sail 3 days before Shabbat. וכן כתוב בהגאות. That's what it says in the הגאות. Uh-huh. Okay, we're not going to finish this today. It's very long, but B'ezrat Hashem, we're doing good. We're moving along good. So let me just read a little bit more. והכי דייק בלשון רבנו שכתב ברי, is that's the way it implies in the language of Rabbeinu, the Tur, right? Because he wrote that the Ri asa kol, the Ri forbade in every manner. Hakol klomar ben להפליג בשבת עצמה. So that means whether to sail on Shabbat itself, ben להפליג באחד משלושה ימים, or less than 3 days. קודם Shabbat, before Shabbat. וצריך לומר, the ספירה ליה, so we have to say that he holds, שלא גזרו חכמים להפליג תוך ג' ימים, that the rabbis only forbade, right, to go within 3 days, קודם השבת, אלא מפני גזירה זו, because of this decree, וקודם לכן, but beforehand, shara it's allowed. משום דחבם דלא שרינן לה, because since we don't allow him להפליג פחות מג' ימים, to sail less than 3 days, איתלה הכרה, there's going to be recognition here, ושוב לא יעשה חבית של שייטין, so then he won't make, right, some kind of life raft there. ולא ינהיג את הספינה, and he won't, right, also, he won't row the boat. Okay, very good. So I guess we'll stop here. There's still a little bit more to do. So B'ezrat Hashem, we'll pick it up next time. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Chazak u'baruch, Laila Tov, and we'll see you tomorrow. All the best.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
God bless.